And good morning. I'm John O'Loughlin. Welcome to my channel. It is called McDuff Lives. And this morning it's December the 20th, 5 days, 4 days before Christmas. And so I'm looking forward to having a few days off. I'll be off Thursday, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. And hope you guys get a chance to spend some time with your friends and family. And those lucky ones who have little children in your lives, I'm jealous of you. I don't have any, and that's what Christmas is really about for me, is trying to make the young ones happy. And I know that it makes everybody else happy when the kids are thrilled with something. Uh, and I would say I'm in favor of Christmas, and there's so much issue, so many people taking cheap shots at Christmas. You know, this whole thing of Krampus and these ugly characters that are coming out, with the horns and all. It's all part of the psyop. Hope people see through that junk. And Santa Claus is tradition. It's an American tradition, and I don't think it's bad. Although I can understand people that think, well, it was invented as a way to take people away from Christ or Jesus, or thinking about religion or spirituality generally. But uh, to me, it was just part of childhood. And I did feel guilty about my little sister, because by the time I knew there was no Santa Claus and she didn't, and I thought, oh my, I shouldn't really lie to little kids like that. But nevertheless, it seems to be something that we all survived. Anyway, good morning, and happy that you're here. A. Baker, Alderson, J. Egare, Laura, and Jay again. Good to see you all. And welcome. Don't think I've seen a couple of you before. Um, but anyway, we are now getting towards the end of How the Nation Was Won, America's Untold Story, 1630 to 1754, by H. Graham Lowry. We are now up to the incredible page of, let's see, where are we? We are all the way to page 501, according to my dog-eared page here. Hello, Colleen. Corky, checking in. All right, Corky Goss. Corky, we never did get to play some music. We have to put that back on the schedule and get together again. Maybe we'll have another McDuff weekend in March. Maybe that might be good. I'd like to see everybody. I miss you guys. Mm. Oh, thank you, Colleen. You're you're certainly welcome. I think we had some real progress pushing against that PCR test, and they came out. The CDC said they're not going to use a PCR test anymore. They didn't exactly say why, but it's pretty obvious because the damn thing is a fake, a big fake, a fake that is just as bad as any war that's been started in the history of humankind, killing people, destroying lives, destroying children's ability to learn how to communicate with facial gestures and understand what people mean by looking in their faces, taking away our individuality and turning us into a bunch of goddamn little interchangeable serfs. No, sir. Fake, 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 fake. Thank you, mobster. That's exactly what we need to do, is just to publicize it, just to say, everybody, hey, this is the worst crime against humanity since Adolf Hitler. All right. Well, the fortress of Louisbourg at the head of the St. Lawrence River, controlling, you know, the access to the St. Lawrence River, was conquered by the Americans, not the British, the Americans. And then the British gave it back. Well, that's called betrayal. And I can understand how you'd feel if you had fought with the American militia to win a major battle against a very well fortified position. And then the people behind your back gave it right back to the enemy, stabbed you in the back. How would you feel? You know, your friends, your brothers, maybe even killed in these battles. And so this is an example of the Americans separating their interests from the British. All right. In April 1746, nearly 900 New England missionen had died waiting for the British. The survivors finally sailed for home, bringing with them a deepening hatred of British rule. Another Winthrop joins the war. Massachusetts had picked a fight which could not be won by simple resistance against injustice. Certainly, the Louisbourg campaign had reawakened its people's Republican temperament after so many decades of grinding despair. Yet resentment alone would not restore the liberty defined by the colony's founder, John Winthrop, who had demanded in 1645 that freedom be based, quote, on the moral law and the constitutions amongst men themselves, to do that only which is good, just and honest. For these higher tasks of the longer war resumed in 1745, there was another heir of the Puritan Republic whose contributions have never been properly acknowledged. He also bore the name of John Winthrop and was America's foremost scientist of the 18th century, as well as the direct descendant of the founder of Massachusetts. Most wrongly, he has been virtually excluded from our history books, though for significant reasons. His entire career, culminating in a prominent role in the revolutionary government of Massachusetts, dramatizes the continuity in Republican outlook from the days of the Puritan founders. According to historical frauds prevailing since the 19th century, that continuity is not supposed to exist. John Winthrop's importance to science has also been obscured, since his method and accomplishments belie similar claims that our 18th century culture was simply a poor imitation of Mother England's. Beyond such motives to deny or suppress Winthrop's role, there is another factor to consider. Until preparations for the revolution were sufficiently in place, he himself was careful to keep the full nature of his activities out of enemy view. Like fellow Bostonian Benjamin Franklin, John Winthrop, whose dates are 1714 to 1779, was a protege of Cotton Mather. Baptized by Mather in the North Church, he enjoyed not only the grandfatherly affection of an old family friend, but the intellectual resources of the most accomplished scholar and prolific writer in America. Like Franklin, the young John Winthrop was acknowledged as something of a child prodigy, prepared at Boston Latin. Don't you love that word prepared? Like they put my father was prepared at Loomis School, um, prep, preparatory school. So that's where you get prepared. Prepared at Boston Latin, he was admitted to Harvard College in 1728 while he was still 13. Cotton Mather died that year, and Winthrop was soon testing the knowledge of his new professors against that of his old mentor. Winthrop's, quote, commonplace book begun in his freshman year, has been preserved. It offers several insights concerning his intellectual development. His reading notes on scientific questions frequently cite an alternative source for comparison, Cotton Mather's The Christian Philosopher of 1721, which rejected the notion of a conflict between science and Christianity in determining the laws of the universe. Kepler and Pascal were among Mather's examples. Interesting choice, Kepler, who defined the elliptical orbit of the planets, among other things, and Pascal, the famous Christian who wants you to accept or deny his wager. His book had been published in London, where the very mention of Leibniz or his method had long been banned by the Venetian party. Remember who the Venetian party is. This is Webster Tarpley's great work to show that the Venetians were, in fact, the money, were the power behind the, the revolution of 1688. Acting through, of course, through the Dutch, through Amsterdam. Winthrop's notes from his freshman year began, however, with even more telling references. Among the Newtonian hucksters promoted at Harvard since the removal of Increase Mather, Winthrop turned to Jonathan Swift. Of William Whiston and Humphrey Ditton, whose works peddled Newton's incompetent plagiarism concerning planetary motion and the calculus, Swift had written a devastating ditty. It could only have been known to Swift's private circles, for the verses were never published then or since. From Winthrop's notebook, they are printed here for the first time. A poem on the longitude by Dr. Swift. You understand the significance of longitude, that this was not, it wasn't until later in the 1800s that somebody figured out how to measure longitude. The way to measure distance around the Earth by drawing lines from pole to pole and determining at what angle from zero, where you start, are you. That was the biggest problem for navigation. They understood latitude, how to know how far they were from the equator or the North Pole, but they did not understand how to figure out longitude at this point. And I know that many of you do know the answer. Okay, a poem on the longitude by Dr. Swift. The longitude missed on by wicked Will Whiston, and not better hit on by good Master Ditton. So Ditton and Whiston may both be blanked on, rhymes with Whiston, so blanked on, and Whiston and Ditton may both be on. Okay. No wonder he didn't publish it. John Winthrop was no adolescent troublemaker, merely bent on ridiculing academic authority. He had a healthy disrespect for intellectual fraud. You know what? So do I. Fucking PCR. Intellectual fraud. Yeah, that gets me angry. And had a tradition of scientific achievement behind him. His own patrimony included John Winthrop Jr., the 17th century governor of Connecticut and correspondent of the young Leibniz. Certainly he enjoyed the work of Jonathan Swift, Leibniz's leading ally in Britain, both of whom he first learned of through Cotton Mather. Winthrop graduated salutatorian of his class in 1732, and in 1738 was appointed to the only academic chair in science in America. Funny, he said Winthrop graduated salutatorian, and what in the usage of his preparatory schools, he said he was prepared, and one would also more properly say he was graduated. This was Harvard's Hollis Professorship of Mathematics and of Natural and Experimental Philosophy, endowed by the London merchant Thomas Hollis, to whom Cotton Mather had dedicated his Christian Philosopher. The endowment prescribed the topics for instruction, including pneumatics, hydrostatics, mechanics, statics, optics, etc., in the elements of geometry, together with the doctrine of proportions, the principles of algebra, conic sections, plane and spherical trigonometry, with the general principles of astronomy and geography, viz., the doctrine of the sphere. Such a Leibnizian curriculum, based upon classical scientific method, ran counter to the schemes of Harvard's controllers even then. But Hollis had set the terms, and John Winthrop was the best hope of meeting them. Benjamin Franklin reported on the ceremonies for Winthrop's installation in his Pennsylvania Gazette. John Winthrop remained one of Franklin's most trusted friends throughout his life, which was ended by pneumonia in 1779. From evidence of the Revolutionary period, Winthrop also was at the very center of Franklin's Republican networks of New England. There are clear suggestions that Winthrop began such a role by the 1740s, though both men took steps to conceal it. He was consulted by George Washington during the French and Indian War and again during the Revolution, when Washington appointed him to oversee the munitions for the Continental Army's siege of Boston. Winthrop's influence in developing the power of reason among the several generations he taught is beyond measure. His students included Sam Adams, John Hancock, and John Adams, who were in constant communication with him during the Revolution. When John Adams agonized over whether the Continental Congress should declare independence from Britain, Winthrop warned him in 1776 that unless the decision were made pretty soon, Massachusetts would do it for themselves. In 1745, with its siege of Louisburg, Massachusetts had done just that. Benjamin Franklin visited Boston at the time on, quote, business of the American Philosophical Society. For that purpose, at least, he must have sought out John Winthrop, who was already engaged in research into electricity and electromagnetics. Franklin was back again the following year and reports in his autobiography that it was then at Boston that he first witnessed experiments in electricity, a subject quite new to me, quote unquote. In the same typically cautious account, Franklin attributes the experience to an imperfectly performed demonstration by a touring Scottish scientist, a Dr. Spence, who was not very expert. Yet, on May the 10th, 1746, John Winthrop presented at Harvard the first controlled experiments in America in electrical phenomena. Franklin began his own work in electricity soon after, returning to Philadelphia that year, and there is no question that these students of Cotton Mather collaborated in the newest field of science. For Winthrop's ongoing research, he commissioned Franklin to obtain an electric battery from London. Following an earthquake in New England in 1755, Winthrop publicly attacked malicious claims that it had resulted from growing use of Franklin's invention, the lightning rod, which applied the lessons of Winthrop's earlier experiments. He also reported that earthquakes produce, quote, undulatory motions of, quote, a wave of earth, generating, quote, both a horizontal and perpendicular motion at the same time. Winthrop's shock wave theory of earthquakes was not appreciated in Europe until 1759. British betrayal of the Louisburg campaign was only beginning in 1745, yet the evidence was already sufficient for America's Republicans to steer the colonies toward determining their own destiny. Massachusetts had already pointed the way. During 1746 and 47, a definite strategy emerged which laid the basis for the later success of the American Revolution. Regardless of whether Britain provided actual support, colonial leaders continued to mobilize the American population to end the French containment. The more the Americans mobilized, the more fearful the British became. Each time the British stepped back from defending their colonies' interests, the colonies stepped forward to assert their own. At the same time, Virginia's patriots prepared the western flank to knock out both Britain and France from control of the Ohio country. In Massachusetts, Governor Shirley continued to press for a full-scale attack on French Quebec. Finally, at the end of May 1746, he received word from the British ministry. Though there was still no authorization for an expedition against Canada, the provincial governors were to request their assemblies to raise troops for that possibility. Since the return of the New England men from Louisburg, colonial support for Shirley's plan was, if anything, even greater, despite the needless loss of so many lives, while the garrison had been left stranded. Massachusetts voted to raise 3,500 men, Connecticut 1,000, New Hampshire 500, and Rhode Island 300. The Duke of Newcastle, now chief minister, had promised to send a squadron with 8 battalions of British regulars to join the New England troops at Louisburg for an attack up the up to St. Lawrence against Quebec. Like the expedition of 1711, the plan called for a simultaneous assault by land on Montreal from northern New York. For this second army, New York raised 1,600 men, New Jersey 500, and Maryland 300. Virginia managed 100 more, despite the decided lack of enthusiasm on the part of Governor Gooch. Gooch's attitude did not bode well, since the ministry had designated him brigadier general to command the American attack on Montreal. The Massachusetts regiments were mustered and ready by mid-July, less than 6 weeks after Shirley's proclamation. Once more, they were to wait in vain. The support promised from Britain was to have sailed at the beginning of May. In the waning days of August, there was still no news of the British ships, then a month and a half overdue. On August 22nd, Shirley wrote to Newcastle, emphasizing that London's delay had already ruled out a successful campaign, which now could not be begun until October, too late to avoid the winter ice. Shirley did not know that a far more monstrous betrayal of the colonies had already been arranged by His Majesty's government through such Jesuitical influences as the Duke of Bedford, Lord John Russell, a cabinet member from one of Britain's most infamous Phoenician families. Lord John Russell. Well, I tell you, I don't know if that is the same Russell that turns out to have founded the Russell and Company, the China trade, but we'll certainly look that up. Maybe somebody can look it up while I'm reading. Wow, Colleen, you really got some drops there. Okay, very good. This is an interesting comment. British and French oligarchical forces had long worked in parallel, though generally behind the scenes. Both governments were subject to such manipulations, while the colonies still awaited Britain's authorization and support for the attack on Canada. The promised battalions were deployed instead for a ghastly deception. The apparent plans to send a British force against Quebec were naturally picked up by French intelligence. Then the troops were loaded onto transports at Portsmouth, provoking a countermove by France. The French response was to assemble in June a fleet of more than 30 warships with 34 transports carrying 3,150 veteran troops, intended to retake Louisburg and flatten any assault against Canada. Meanwhile, the British troops were unloaded from their ships and the expedition for America was canceled. Lord Russell had objected that such a campaign might further a tendency toward independence by the colonies. There were definite suspicions in America that the British had never intended to support the conquest of Canada in the first place. Whether by arrangement or by deception, London's maneuvers ensured that the French fleet was free to attack Louisbourg and the entire New England coast. While Shirley was left in the dark concerning the decisions in London, the Jesuits of Quebec launched new Indian attacks against New England's frontiers. Shirley proposed that the colonial army already raised to attack Montreal be deployed to seize the French and Indian base in Upper New York instead. It had been established at Crown Point on Lake Ticonderoga as a staging ground for their incursions against the northern colonies. You ever been to that Crown Point on Lake Ticonderoga? I happened to pass through there one day and stopped and walked around and went into the exhibit house there. And it's small. It's impressive in the sense that how could such an important battle have been waged in such a tiny and insignificant place that doesn't seem to have any, there it was a very small engagement, but it turns out to have been one of the most important ones of the French and Indian War. David, wow, that's a great one. The courtesy title of the Duke of Bedford's eldest son and heir is Marquess of Tavistock. Yeah, well, maybe you'll have a chance to look and see who is John Russell, Lord John Russell, at the same time. Yeah, these guys are hidden agents of the Jesuits, according to our author, Graham Lowry. This is an important aspect of history that has not been written down. And once again, I find myself taking my virtual hat off to Graham Lowry and the folks at the Schiller and LaRoche organization that put together and financed all of this tremendous work. A great book and a great way to preserve a part of history that otherwise would be erased. You probably won't see this in Wikipedia. Virginia's Governor Gooch, brigadier general, but Tidewater puppet. Tidewater puppet, that means Tidewater, meaning the speculators who were in the Tidewater towns, Norfolk, Portsmouth, Virginia, Hampton, Newport News, that area, that would have been the British oriented, the loyalist types that were financially well off due to their trade with Britain and their speculative activities with regard to Western lands. Shirley enlisted the support of Governor Clinton of New York, however, and by late September 1500, Massachusetts troops were on their way to Albany to rendezvous with New York militiamen and drive the French from Crown Point. This independent assertion of colonial interest was also contrary to British policy and was defeated in this case by a threat from France. While the Massachusetts contingent was still marching toward New York, word arrived that a French fleet had been sighted off Nova Scotia. Though long delayed by illness, unfavorable winds, and the lagging pace of the transport ships, the fleet had not been challenged by the British Navy at any point. The Massachusetts regiments deployed to take Crown Point were recalled and the militia fully mobilized. Within days, more than 8,000 men at arms crowded the narrow streets of Boston. Connecticut prepared to send 6,000 more, and the defenses of Boston Harbor were strengthened. Fortunately for New England, the French fleet was nearly destroyed in a fierce storm and rendered incapable of assaulting even Louisburg. The returning remnants reached France in December, yet it was 6 months later before the Duke of Newcastle even wrote to Shirley that there would be no British support for any undertaking against Canada. The ministry ordered that the American regiments raised for the original expedition be disbanded as cheap as possible and that no more military actions be undertaken by the colonies, quote unquote. Thus, the government of King George II had not only betrayed colonial efforts to remove the French threat from Canada, it also demanded that America confine itself for the future to waiting for French attacks. By the time this right to die directive reached the colonies in August 1747, they had endured 2 years of escalating warfare since the French surrender at Louisburg. Jesuit tribes had overrun settlements from Rochester, New Hampshire to Saratoga, New York, and in 1746 had seized Fort Massachusetts, the key to the colony's western defense. Within lands claimed by Virginia beyond the Ohio River, the French also began strengthening their western line, building up forts Miami, Ouantinon, and Vincennes. By 1747, French and even Spanish ships began making hit and run attacks along the Atlantic seaboard. One French raiding party ventured that summer up the Delaware River to within 20 miles of Philadelphia. For America's nation-building project of opening the West, the Louisburg campaign had generated tremendous momentum. British and French countermeasures now restricted the colonies, however, to pursuing the course which least depended on immediate military considerations. The most feasible route still lay through the western mountains of northern Virginia, the gateway established by Alexander Spotswood a generation before. The King's confirmation in 1745 of Lord Fairfax's entire Virginia claim had vastly improved that prospect. Its importance became even greater as the betrayal of the American war effort became clearer. In 1746, surveying parties set out to establish the final boundary of the Northern Neck Proprietary, the northwestern line from the Allegheny source of the Potomac, where the Fairfax Stone still stands today, north of Thomas, West Virginia. One of the surveyors was Peter Jefferson, the father of President Thomas Jefferson. And I've made reference to the great map, Jefferson Fry map of about 1750 or so. Lord Thomas Fairfax was well informed of the treacherous turns of British colonial policy. He had spent 8 years in England before winning the settlement of his claim. He remained there for 2 years more, however, during the period from the Louisburg campaign to the order disbanding the American army. Following that miserable decision, he returned to Virginia in the summer of 1747. From the subsequent pattern of developments, it is clear that he brought with him some new tactics for the battle for the West. He proceeded directly to Belvoir, the Potomac estate of William Fairfax, which lay within full view of Mount Vernon, the home of Lawrence Washington, now married to William's daughter Anne. 15-year-old George Washington, largely in Lawrence's care since their father's death, was already a frequent guest at Belvoir. Now, you know where Belvoir is, don't you? Yes, you do. That's Fort Belvoir. It's still there. It is the home of the Army and Air Force's intelligence. It was where the Sante prison camp was first discovered by the intelligence officers of the Air Force studying aerial photographs. It is where the Americans set up a battery to try to sink the British ships after they had raided Alexandria and the Battle of Fort Washington and were sailing away with their prizes, where Porter, Fitzjohn Porter, no, not Fitzjohn Porter, the earlier Porter, David Porter, the admiral or commodore, set up batteries to fire at the British fleet, which almost stopped them and did slow them down enough that by the time they got to Baltimore, the American militia had surrounded the city and was prepared. One of the most important actions in America at that time was the attempt by the British to raid up the Potomac River. It slowed them down and caused them to lose the Battle of Baltimore. And that, of course, is how we got our national anthem. Thank you, Colleen. I do appreciate the love of Kennedy's man to smash the CIA. Of course, that's where we started. What, 4 years ago, is it? Anyway, we still carry on and think we're getting somewhere. I think we made some substantial progress when they had to stop pretending that the PCR test was going to be able to diagnose any disease, much less this so-called pandemic. Robert Kovacs. That's a fun little intellectual exercise, but it's one I've been through many, many times, so we're not going to go there today. Lawrence Washington was no ordinary planter. Perhaps more than any other Virginian at the time, he was inspired by the example set by Alexander Spotswood. Lawrence maintained his father's iron-making enterprise, as did John Spotswood, the eldest son of the founder of Virginia's iron industry. He also looked to America's future in the West. In 1747, he purchased 700 acres in the Shenandoah Valley from Lord Fairfax, and 1,300 more the following year. But during the first year of the proprietor's return, Lawrence Washington also took an extraordinary initiative to push forward the western frontier. With obvious collaboration from Lord Fairfax, Washington circulated a petition seeking subscribers to a new venture to be chartered as the Ohio Company. All right, you've heard of the Ohio Company, I imagine. The western portions of the Fairfax grant were now open to settlement and no longer subject to the dictates of royal government, whether from London or from Williamsburg. At their farthest boundaries, the proprietors' lands nearly reached the Ohio River system, the key to the huge territory between the Great Lakes and the Mississippi. Immediately beyond the Fairfax claim, the Ohio Company proposed to establish the necessary trading posts, settlements, and forts to begin developing this vast potential of the Virginia colony. Among Lawrence Washington's initial partners were his brother William Augustine Washington and George Fairfax, the son of the proprietor's cousin, William Fairfax. The company soon included Spotswood's former protege, John Mercer, and his son, George, Mercer's pupil, George Mason, whose father was one of Spotswood's Knights of the Golden Horseshoe, and Robert Dinwiddie, whose brother had married Mason's sister. From the outset, the company's London agent was John Hanbury, a leading merchant in the Virginia trade, which was overseen by Dinwiddie as Surveyor General of Customs. Hanbury was recruited in 1748 while his friend Dinwiddie was in London. On October 20th, 1747, the Ohio Company's petition was presented to Governor Gooch and the Virginia Council. The subscribers proposed to settle 500,000 acres below the headwaters of the Ohio and east and south of the Allegheny and Monongahela rivers. The plan was tabled. Early in 1748, Hanbury presented their case to the Crown, arguing that the 1744 Treaty of Lancaster had confirmed Virginia's western claims and that expansion, quote, to the branches of the Ohio and the Lake Erie would extend His Majesty's trade as far as the Mississippi. The Board of Trade was persuaded that, quote, The settlement of the country lying to the westward of the great mountains, as it was the center of the British dominions, would be for His Majesty's interest, and the advantage and security of Virginia and the neighboring colonies, as by means thereof a more extensive trade and commerce might be carried on with the Indians inhabiting those parts. And it would likewise be a proper step towards checking the encroachments of the French by interrupting part of their communication from the legements of the Great Lakes to the river Mississippi and that of the Indians in their interest. The political heirs of Alexander Spotswood were about to turn his dream into reality. Franklin's call to arms. The formation of the Ohio Company was a clear signal that Americans were preparing to take matters into their own hands and open the West regardless of Britain's foul deal with France to prevent that. A Swedish traveler in America at the time who visited with Franklin reflected the growing sentiment, quote, "There is reason enough for doubting whether the king, if he had the power, would wish to drive the French from their possessions in Canada. The English government has therefore reason to regard the French in North America as the chief power that urges their colonies to submission." Unquote. Well, there it is. That's exactly what Lowry has been telling us the whole book, and that is that the French secretly were allied with the British, the Jesuits working with the Jesuitical or Venetian party in the British oligarchy, under the weak and easily led George II, to keep the American colonies enthralled with the necessity of trade and commerce under British terms, where the Americans could not develop their own industries and thereby threatened to become independent. The formation of the Ohio Company was a clear signal that the Americans were preparing to take matters into their own hands. Franklin certainly had no doubts that Britain was the enemy of the American colonies. In a lengthy history of Pennsylvania, which Franklin published anonymously in London in 1759, he reviewed the British betrayal of Louisburg and their cynical pledge to mount an expedition against Quebec. Quote, "In the beginning of the year 1746, the ministers affected to entertain a project for the reduction of Canada. The northern colonies were severally called upon to contribute their respective quotas toward it, which they cheerfully concurred in doing, seduced by their interests and their inclinations into a belief that the whole line of our colonies would not thus be agitated, nor their Indian allies induced to take up the hatchet in conjunction with them merely by way of feint to facilitate a peace." The political fallout from this British hoax included a worsening of relations with the Iroquois Six Nations, important allies who once again had serious grounds for doubting the word of the English colonies and of their great chief, King George II. The French Jesuits were busily at work trying to lure the Iroquois into their own orbit, and their Canadian tribes continued a broad assault on the colony's frontiers. The settlements proposed by the Ohio Company along the Monongahela and Allegheny Forks underscored a pressing problem for Pennsylvania. It was the only colony without a militia system, thanks to the Quaker proprietors and merchants who dominated its government. Western Pennsylvania was largely unsettled, and even though the Indian trade on this frontier was productive of great advantages to the proprietaries, there were no provisions to defend this corridor against French and Indian incursions from Lake Erie. A month after the Ohio Company filed its petition in Williamsburg, in the fall of 1747, Benjamin Franklin took action in Philadelphia to break the political deadlock over the issue of Pennsylvania's defense. Following a series of articles on the subject in his Pennsylvania Gazette, he published on November 17th the pamphlet Plain Truth, signed simply by, quote, "a tradesman of Philadelphia." It was a devastating attack on the smugness of the city's wealthy merchants, who imagined that they were safe from attack of any kind, Franklin made the most of the recent raids by enemy ships up the Delaware, quote, in two different cruises this last summer in our bay, and denounced the indifference of the colony's leading figures, both Quaker and non Quaker. It seems as if our greatest men of both parties had sworn the ruin of our country and invited the French, our most inveterate enemy, to destroy it. Whether merchant or tradesman, Philadelphian or frontiersman, the inhabitants of the colony required a common defense, Franklin argued. He more than insinuated that the people would not tolerate being placed in mortal jeopardy to gratify the selfish whims of a wealthy minority. Concerning the prospects for Western settlement, Franklin made a special point which also addressed Britain's betrayal of the Louisburg campaign. And now I'm quoting from Franklin. The French know the power and importance of the Six Nations, and spare no artifice, pains, or expense to gain them to their interest. By their priests they have converted many to their religion, and they have openly espoused their cause. The rest appear irresolute which part to take, though we had numerous forces on their borders ready to second and support them. What may then be expected now those forces are, by orders from the Crown, to be disbanded, when our boasted expedition is laid aside through want, as it may appear to them, either of strength or courage, when they see that the French and their Indians boldly and with impunity ravage the frontiers of New York and scalp the inhabitants, when those few Indians that engage with us against the French are left exposed to their resentment. When they consider these things, is there no danger that they may be wholly gained over by our enemies and join in the war against us? If such should be the case, which God forbid, how soon may the mischief spread to our frontier counties? And what may we expect to be the consequence but deserting of plantations, ruin, bloodshed, and confusion? Franklin proposed a bold tactic to protect the colony and the eastern flank of the settlements planned by the Ohio Company. To circumvent opposition by Thomas Penn and his corrupt proprietary supporters, Franklin urged the creation of an independent voluntary militia to be paid for by private subscription. He promised, quote, to propose in a few days an association to be generally signed for that purpose. His pamphlet Plain Truth had argued the way to secure peace is to be prepared for war. A week after the pamphlet's publication, Franklin rallied a packed house in Philadelphia to prepare for just that, regardless of the policies ruling them or in London, there or in London. On that night of November 24th, 1,200 men, soon joined by 10,000 more throughout the colony, put their signatures to Franklin's, quote, form of association, unquote. The document declared, quote, that this colony is in a naked, defenseless state, without fortifications or militia of any sort, that we are at a great distance from the mother country and cannot, on any emergency, receive assistance from thence, that through the multiplicity of other affairs of greater importance, as we presume, no particular care has hitherto been taken by the government at home of our protection. An humble petition to the Crown for that purpose, signed by a great number of hands, having yet had no visible effect. That the assemblies of this province, by reason of their religious principles, have not done, nor are likely to do anything for our defense, notwithstanding repeated applications to them for that purpose, that being thus unprotected by the government under which we live against our foreign enemies that may come to invade us, as we think it absolutely necessary we do, hereby for our mutual defense and security, form ourselves into an association, and imploring the blessing of heaven on our undertaking, do agree solemnly with each other in the manner following, unquote. The subscribers pledged to furnish themselves with arms and ammunition by January 1st, 1748, form themselves into companies of 50 to 100 men, and elect their own officers, who would then establish regiments by county and elect regimental commanders. All companies were required to hold regular exercises in military training. The regiments of each county, at their annual review, would elect by ballot 4 deputies to serve on the General Military Council, whose orders and regulations, quote, shall have the force of laws with us. The deputies were to be those of the most note for their virtue, prudence, and ability, and the entire association was to act only on principles of reason, duty, and honor. 10 companies were raised in Philadelphia and more than 100 in the rest of the colony. The officers of the Philadelphia regiment elected Franklin to be their commanding colonel, but he declined, for he had an even larger command to fulfill. In most dramatic fashion, Franklin had displayed the power of a Republican movement. When the policies of government deny the most basic interests of the governed, quote, Poor Richard, his fictional almanacker, born on the day Charles II revoked the Massachusetts Charter in 1684, had indeed become an American prince without subjects. The association, Franklin insisted, was a militia of free men, which therefore would not tolerate the British Army's barbaric mode of discipline. The General Military Council was specifically prohibited from ordering any form of corporal punishment or even a system of fines. Franklin's only concession was that the militia companies themselves might impose little fines for such offenses as failing to report, and that the proceeds be applied to the purchase of drums, colors, etc., or to be given in prizes, or to refresh their weary spirits after exercises. Franklin even designed heraldic banners for the militia companies, complete with mottos, quote, of patriotic defiance. Well, 5 minutes to noon. It's a good time to stop. We have obviously got one more batch of this book to read. We're on page 517, and the book concludes on page 533. So that's perfect amount to leave for next Monday. I will be back with you then to finish up this great historical treasure, How the Nation Was Won by H. Graham Lowry. I'll see you tonight for Minefields. I've got a lot on my mind today, and I'm feeling good because somehow, some way, with all the work that we and thousands, if not millions of people have done around the country and around the world, the PCR has fallen. Yeah, just like Babylon, it's fallen.